Welcome to psychology. This is going to be our introduction to the field. We'll talk about some historical background for how psychology came to be. We'll talk about some key names and perspectives that we need to be familiar with to understand how psychology works and how to apply it. We'll also talk about where it's gone and where it needs to go in the future. Finally, we'll end with some of my suggestions for how to do well in this course and how to set the right expectations. Here's my general contact information. This is also in the syllabus. What I want to make clear is that I'm a relaxed person and you should feel comfortable getting in touch with me in whatever form that you feel comfortable with. If you're a phone person, that's fine. Feel free to call me. Just note that my office hours are in the syllabus and those are the only times I'm guaranteed to be in the office, although I'm around a lot more than that. So if you want to meet in person, and you have a time outside of my office hours that works better, feel free to shoot me a Canvas message or an email and we'll set a time that works for both of us. And of course, I'm checking email, I'm checking Canvas messages all the time, and I should definitely get back to you within a day, usually much sooner if you get in touch with me. Here's some information about me as we get to know about each other in the beginning of the semester. My background is in industrial organizational psychology, basically taking psychology and applying it to workplace situations. You can see that I've been around the Ohio area, BG for my undergrad, and the University of Akron for my PhD. I also have a graduate certificate of industrial gerontology. So you can see that lines up with some of my professional interests. Personality assessment in particular, I've published a number of papers and studies talking about essentially why do people hate having to take personality tests in the course of applying for a job, and what are some ways to make it better. Also talk about workplace hygiene, what causes people to want to care about washing their hands or their hand hygiene, for example. And get to know a little bit about me personally. I like to be active. Sometimes I do better at that than others, but I usually have some sort of a half marathon I'm working toward. I like to do outdoorsy stuff when I can, but since getting married a few years back, I've been doing more of these things, more domestic stuff lately. I have married, as I mentioned, and I have a young son that we like to do a lot of dad stuff with. Let's start with some true-false. I like to do these to show that sometimes things that we thought we knew sometimes turn out to be not as accurate as we thought. How accurate is eyewitness testimony? The fact that they have a lot of mistakes is true. Sometimes there's so many mistakes that we wonder why we take those accounts into such high-stakes contexts in making decisions about guilt and innocence. What's the best way to get people to learn? It is not just punishment, although it's important to remember that punishment is part of the bag of tricks you want to have. Rewards, punishments, but also for humans, we need to do more advanced, high-level stuff. Figure out what people are thinking and how we can change that. Nature-nurture is going to be a big issue, as we'll see. Oftentimes the question is to figure out which way do the scales tip, more toward nurture, more toward nature. This is actually true. About half of our IQ is inherited from the genes that our parents passed down to us. This is a little bit of a tricky question. The first 3 years are very important, and they're, instead of more important though, I would probably say that they are just different. As we'll find out in the neuroscience chapter and lifespan development, the first 3 years, the brain is doing a lot of different things compared to how it develops after the first 3 years, but they're not necessarily more important. Think about a year from now. How much of the information we learn in this class are you going to remember? Chances are about a third to half of what we cover. Does that mean that that information is no longer in the brain? This is false. Once you learn something and can remember it the next day, it should stay in your memory for a long, long time. The problem is the pathway to retrieving that memory becomes cloudy. So just remember, you're not forgetting the stuff you learn in school, just the pathways to get to it are tougher to reach. And this is straight from a psychological myths book, so don't blame me. This myth is out there, and the truth is, this is false. Even when you control for the fact that men tend to drive more than women, they still get into about 70% more accidents. So one more example that maybe some myths that we have turn out to be false when we actually look for data. Let's get started with a very general discussion of what psychology is. What names come to mind? Chances are you're thinking of names like Freud, maybe Pavlov and Skinner. And those are very traditional names in the founders of psychology. I think what I hope to achieve this semester is learn a few, not a ton, but a few new names who are more recent contributors. Is psychology common sense? In some ways, you're going to read the textbook and you might think some of these things were obvious. But the most important thing is, how does something get into the textbook? And we're going to find out that it's the very careful process of research and critical thinking. And since it's such a pain, that process we think of as actually being uncommon sense. It's much easier just to look at our environment, make some conclusions, and then move on. Psychology is much more regimented than that to get to what we think of as the truth. If you think of a Venn diagram, psychology has a lot of overlaps with other fields. Probably sociology has the most, but other fields such as economics, for example, also have a lot of overlap with psychology. I like to do key quotes that illustrate a concept. If you've taken a biology class, perhaps you've heard of Stephen Jay Gould, notable biologist and historian of science in general. And this is the idea that just because we have a strong belief or confidence that we know something, in many cases, those are the ones we need to question the most to be sure that those are actually founded in real data, real information. Perhaps you've heard of this Mozart effect. Maybe a more updated version would be Baby Einstein. The Mozart effect basically said that babies who are exposed to the music of Mozart tend to see a boost in IQ. Here's the problem though. The initial study that showed this Mozart effect showed babies, and then a week later after exposure to Mozart showed a modest increase in IQ. That research was way overgeneralized to say, oh, if it changes in a week and babies' IQs can fluctuate pretty drastically, then it would change over the next 20 years. And that clearly is not the truth. The problem is that a lot of these myths that aren't supported by data, or the right kind of data in this case, have real consequences. States devoted hundreds of thousands of dollars in their budget to give Mozart CDs to newborns. And that is essentially money wasted, since we didn't have any data to support that kind of conclusion. Let's talk about, in a little bit more detail, the core essence of the field of psychology. This sounds simple, but it's very important. We have the way people think, and we have the actions that we can observe. And at different times in history, we've emphasized one or the other, as we'll see. Of course, now we know that they're important, and that although not perfectly correlated, they are related. How you're thinking does translate in some way to how you act. We also, unlike sociology, where you're focusing on large group dynamics, or politics, where you're focusing on large demographic voting patterns, psychology is about individual thoughts and decisions and actions. It's important to remember that psychology is a science. In some ways, psychology has a bit of an inferiority complex compared to the other hard sciences. And so your textbook and elsewhere continually deals with this inferiority complex by continually saying that it is a science. What it means is that we're looking at empirical, oftentimes numerical or quantitative evidence to support our conclusions. This process, unfortunately, takes a long time to do it right so that we don't read false conclusions. So that means it's a very deliberate or slow, in other words, process. But that's the best we've got, unfortunately. Since psychology is a science, we're doing the scientific method. And of course, the key is, at some points in psychology's history, we focused mostly on theory. At other points, we focused mostly on, let's get the numbers, and then that will tell us how the world works. Unfortunately, you need both. And again, this takes time, this takes skill and practice. And finally, as you can see, a general theme is to have a healthy skepticism about what we think we know about the world around us. If you've heard of Occam's razor, this is basically the idea that the simplest explanation is usually the most likely. It may be fun to think about very complex theories about why people think the way they do, but you can only do that after you've eliminated more of the simple ones. For this quote, we're digging way into the past. Philosopher Sir Francis Bacon. Basically, the idea is that, of course, knowledge is power, ignorance is powerlessness. But the more important part is that oftentimes we find in psychology that people are overconfident. And when they really feel strongly about knowing something, oftentimes, as we discussed before, that is a point where maybe they're not basing that on factual information. So, how is what you learn in psychology going to be beneficial to you in your personal life, on the job? It's not just the facts, the people, the theories you learn in psychology, but it's also the fact that the skills you learn to approach the world in a scientific and specifically psychological fashion will spill over into other domains. So it's not just what you're learning and whether you use that or not, it's the skills and the process that hopefully you'll be able to apply usefully later on. Let's talk about a brief history of psychology. As you can see from these pictures, psychology started with a very big diversity problem. Basically, a bunch of old white guys. Now, there were some structural, societal factors that led to this situation. And as we'll have to see later on, more recent psychology has been trying to update some of the limited views of these founding fathers. But these are what we have. This is our history. We can't change it. All we can do is work to better understand it and correct when appropriate. So, of course, we have Darwin. Remember that trying to explain human behavior in the past, 200, 300, and before years ago, often led down roads of religious explanations. The gods willed it, demonic possession, things such as that. Darwin was so influential because not only can genes that are passed down from parents affect the way you appear, but it's also likely and has since been proven that they can also affect how we behave. And that really was a revolutionary new way to think about human behavior. We also have Wilhelm Wundt. He was a physiologist. Notice a theme here. Many of these founding fathers of psychology were not actually psychologists. But he was the first one who started to do kind of psychology types of research. And look, less than 150 years ago, a lot of this was doing sort of perception and reaction times that would lead into a good foundation for how to do experiments moving forward. When did psychology enter the mainstream? That would be sort of the publication of William James's first textbook, The Principles of Psychology, just before the turn of the century. And of course, perhaps the biggest name in terms of pop culture appeal is Sigmund Freud. Did a lot of psychoanalysis exploring the unconscious. We'll have plenty more to say about Freud as we go on, but we can't ignore his real contributions to the field. Many of you might have heard of Jean Piaget, again, an educator, not a psychologist, but really asked a lot of questions of how to structure human cognitive development. At what age should a child be able to do a certain kind of problem? And then finally, two more famous names, Pavlov and Skinner, that developed the operant and classical conditioning learning principles that you'd find in basically any introductory psychology textbook. Very important discoveries that they made, although of course with humans they're not as simple as they believe them to be, and so we've had to do a lot of exploration for more higher level learning that Pavlov and Skinner can't account for. These aren't necessarily hugely important for exam purposes, but it's important to know that psychology is one big blob, but most people who are experts in the field choose one area of expertise. So we have lots of different subfields of psychology. Perhaps the most common one that people think of would be clinical psychology. Of course, I have to throw in IO psychology. Again, most people probably would not have heard of this, but it is a key field, and BG has one of the top programs internationally. And also we have the relatively recent phenomenon that you can take other fields and then put a psychology after it, and then you've created a new field. So of course, we've seen growing interest in environmental psychology and forensic, and especially sports psychology. Here is perhaps the most important information for our purposes today. Perspectives of psychology. Why do we need perspectives? Think about something like chemistry. You have two chemicals, and if you have similar conditions, you know what's going to happen when you combine those chemicals. You don't need a lot of different theories to explain that reaction. However, psychology and dealing with humans involves a lot more error. And so you can have one explanation for why someone behaved or acted the way they did, and then upon deeper exploration, find that that theory didn't really apply to them. So it's nice to have multiple theories to be able to fall back onto. If one doesn't really seem to fit that situation or that person, we can just try another one. We'll start with some of the classics. First of all, we have, and these sort of go in the order in which they came into popularity, the psychodynamic perspective, very Freudian, looking at unconscious or hidden thoughts and processes for why people think irrationally or have certain psychological disorders. We also have the humanistic perspective. This is, in some cases, I like to call the maybe touchy-feely perspective. Think about the psychodynamic. It's focusing on what is wrong with people and how did they get that way. Humanistic evolved as sort of a counterbalance to that. Let's not just focus on what's wrong with people. Let's focus on what makes people want to achieve their full potential. So things like self-esteem are big variables when we talk about the humanistic perspective. But a lot of these theorists, psychodynamic and humanistic, focused a lot about the way people thought, the way people felt, and some big names in the field, most notably Skinner that we talked about, felt that they weren't making enough progress, so let's ditch all this talk about how people think and focus only on how they behave. It's a very sort of minimalist theoretical perspective, but we can't ignore it. People do respond to rewards and punishments, oftentimes much more so than we like to think we do. But of course, the behavioral perspective, while powerful, can't explain it all. And so in the 70s, we had what's called the cognitive revolution, in which we did realize that the behavioral perspective needs more, needs to be fleshed out. Let's add to it. And instead of especially going back to the way Freud tried to understand how people think, let's turn to new technology and new theories to have a more quantitative or scientific understanding of how people think. Adding on to these classic perspectives, we have a few new ones. First of all, as we mentioned before, psychology has had a diversity problem in its origins, and so much of the sociocultural perspective is expanding this westernized, white, and older view and seeing what things that came out of that generalize across cultures and which don't. Also, we have the neuroscience and evolutionary perspectives. In some ways, we just didn't have the technology in the 40s, 50s, and 60s to really use genetic or neuroscience perspectives or to supplement these classic perspectives. But of course now, given the drastic advances in technology, in neuroscience, and our mapping of the human genome, we really have no choice but to force new findings from that technology to help us continually re-understand or re-examine what we think we know about these classic perspectives. Just to illustrate a little bit more how these perspectives are different, I'd like to put a cartoon, hopefully to maybe lighten things up a little bit. Finding your inner self and feeling good about it, feeling validated, feeling high self-esteem. This is a classic humanistic way to approach life. If you've worked in a job for a long time, you've probably noticed that there's often a lot of management interventions or fads. How often do they last? Well, it may seem like they're just throwing stuff at a wall and seeing whether it sticks. And in some ways, this is an oversimplification, but sort of like the behavioral perspective. I don't care what my employees think. I'm just going to try this, and if they respond in the way that I'm happy with, I'm going to keep using it. If not, we'll try something else. If any of you have read or are familiar with The Little Engine That Could, think about what the little engine says to himself as he's trying to get up the hill. I think I can. I think I can. It might sound simple, but we know that people who do have positive thoughts tend to, especially when they're specific to a context, I think I can, I know I can get a job. I know that my effort will not go to waste. It'll be somehow rewarded. People who think that way are much more likely to achieve the goals that they set for themselves. And that's a classic tenet of the cognitive perspective. We also have the psychodynamic perspective. If you are interested in very complex, so again, not Occam's razor here, explanations for how people tick, oftentimes that's a very psychodynamic way to view things. I don't see this perspective as being as relevant nearly as it used to be. But given our Occam's razor view, once we've ruled out some of the other perspectives, then it would be appropriate to go down the psychodynamic avenue. And finally, the sociocultural perspective. Think about how different cultures would react to somebody being drunk and obnoxious in a plane or in a theater. Chances are there's going to be a lot of different contexts, a lot of different ways that you feel the people around you are thinking about you. Let's also talk about where psychology is moving for the future. Of course, we'll revisit many of these themes over the course of the semester, one being nature versus nurture. With new research, new technology, we have to update our older theories with this new information. And we are also having the ability to use more precision in seeing which way the scales tip in favor of nurture or nature. The one thing to keep in mind, though, is that it's one thing to be able to link genes to physical traits and appearance. It seems to be much more difficult, on the other hand, to link genes to how people think and how people behave. So that continues to be a big challenge moving forward. We also have the issue of stability versus change. How do people change over time? And more importantly, How does research and what we think we know about a topic, when does that become dated? Presidential elections are a great example. A lot of the rules that we thought we knew about why people vote and why people turn out turned out to be much different for the recent election cycles. And of course, this also goes to, we have a study and we have to consider what sample that study was conducted on. And then we think about if we're going to apply the results of that study to a different sample, a different culture, for example, do we think it's going to generalize? Why? And maybe do we need to do a separate study to test that theory? Here's another big issue as well, rationality versus irrationality. Chemicals in a chemistry setting tend to be very predictable and rational. Humans, on the other hand, that's not always the case. What that means is it introduces a lot more error for us to deal with. Some people have said that humans are too irrational to quantify. Of course, we're not going to go with that belief, but we have to know going in that we're climbing or fighting an uphill battle, which means that even if we have a good idea of what we really want to measure, someone's personality trait, we know that our measures are never going to be as accurate as we would like them to be. So just like measuring or detecting cancer is full of error, a lot of our psychological measures are full of error, and then some even more compared to biological measures. There's also the idea of theoretical error. Sometimes we have data and we've got a theoretical framework that just doesn't seem to fit. So then we have to revise our theories. As we wrap things up, I just want to give you some pointers for how to do well in this class. These are my suggestions. These are based on research as well. Distribute your study time. Don't just try to cram it all in right before the exam. Also, in keeping with this distributed study time, some students just disappear. I don't hear from them from weeks. That usually is a recipe for not getting the grade that you're looking for. Part of the class is a simple matter of being organized and getting stuff done and done on time and not forgetting to answer a question. I'd hate for anybody to lose points just because they didn't read the instructions. Also, listen actively. While you're learning the material, maybe take notes, maybe write down questions, and remember to ask them in the discussions or me personally if you need to. Another key point is that don't just learn the material in one way. Don't just learn it from slideshows. Don't just learn it from the book. Exposure to material in different contexts from different sources tends to lead to that material to stick much better. We also have resources available. Use your classmates in the discussion boards. There's the Teaching and Learning Center at BGSU Firelands and the Writing Lab as well. And of course, have an open mind. And what this means is try and apply some of the stuff you learn to things you see in your life, people you know, friends, family, because when you make those connections through having an open mind, it's much more likely that the material is going to stick. Just to drive home the point that being in a psychology class does have benefits. We talked about some myths that people might have about psychology. Well, once those are debunked or covered in an intro to psychology class, later on, I forget the time interval, but later on, there was a 57% reduction in belief in myths. I also like to have key concepts that are maybe moving outside what the textbook says. So in this case, we're talking about multitasking. I know especially with an online class, it can be difficult to just focus on one thing when you have a computer in front of you. But what this is showing is that students who go back and forth versus complete one and complete another take less time if they just focus on the one task and then move to the next. And also, the research shows that the performance on these are better. So I know everybody thinks they're a good multitasker, and even if you are relative to others, you'd still be better off just doing one task at a time. Let's do some true-false to see how we're doing with the material so far. If you remember, psychology is less than 150 years old, much younger than many other science fields such as chemistry, biology, and so on. Clinical psychologists and psychiatrists, while maybe both do therapy, they are definitely not the same, as clinical psychologists may be more on the research end, and psychiatrists are much more heavily focused on the medical aspects of therapy and treatment. You might be wondering what kinds of things are going to be on the exam. I just want to make sure that you know that I'm not trying to trick you so that I present things in class on the slides, and then once it comes to exam time, I dig through the book and find a bunch of picky stuff that we never talked about. You can be sure that that's not going to happen. Let's see about the material we learned today. If you remember it yesterday, has it stuck? Yes, in general. What about if you can't remember it the next day? Is that an idea of short-term memory? No, as we'll find out, short-term memory, even though a day sounds short-term by our definition, the technical definition of short-term memory is more about seconds and minutes and not days. Discovery learning is sort of set your own goals, decide what you want to learn. That sort of empowers or enables people to pick what they are most interested in. Does that result in better learning? In fact, no. For scientific information, there seems to be strong research that some sort of lecture or structured format tends to be the best for science learning. We often have this idea of about 10%, using 10% of our brain's capacity, remembering 10%. Most of the time, that's just an anchor that we use, but in reality, those numbers are false. You're going to recall a lot more about what you learn in this class, specifically if you use some of the techniques that we talked about previously. Let's do a fill in the blank to see how we're doing with the perspectives of psychology. If you want to know when your child will develop a certain cognitive skill, I sort of gave it away there. This is the cognitive perspective. Of course, if we're talking genetics and their influence on disorders or psychological variables, we're dealing with the evolutionary perspective. If we're dealing with learning that involves specifically reinforcement, reward, and punishments, we are dealing with the learning perspective. Also the behavioral, we could call it the behavioral as well. Will my strategy for finding a date or otherwise work in a different country or culture? This is the sociocultural. Will my techniques generalize successfully? If we're talking about feeling better about who we are and feeling more valued, would I be bullied less? This is a classic humanistic example. And also, if we want to know the effect of our behavior in terms of how our brain processes it, or in terms of our behavior damaging aspects of our brain, we are dealing with the neuroscience perspective. And the idea that drinking alcohol kills brain cells is somewhat true, but overestimated as well. Here we have a multiple choice question. Which is the best definition of psychology? Notice this first one sounds like it could be pretty good, but again, with the multiple choice, sometimes they get a little tricky if you don't read all the options, because we're looking for the best answer. And of course, adding the word scientific into that definition makes it an even better answer than option A. So the correct answer is C. I also like to introduce some research when I can, and the idea here is just to get you willing to look into answering the questions you want, and not just finding an opinion piece about it, but rather we have access to all kinds of studies, and that is a great thing, but the problem is looking at the primary research, the actual articles, is not an easy thing. So this is just another example of the answers that we want usually don't come as easily as we'd like them to. But let's get over that. Let's learn how to look at these studies and develop this skill. So that's my goal in showing you things like this. So, for example, these slideshows that we're watching now, do they work? And if I, for example, in my in-person class, make these available, will attendance drop? Well, to answer that question, I looked up this study. And what they found was that there was not a significant difference in attendance between the classes that had these online lectures available and those that didn't. Now, another question is, has this study and effect been replicated? Later research tended to actually show an attendance effect that this one didn't. So sometimes the answer is a little bit more muddy than we'd like. I'm going to keep going with this practice, although I'll have to keep watching the research to see how it develops. Also, from the same study, I just want to, and of course this won't be on the exam, but I want to get you willing to actually look at some of the data. Stats aren't easy, and even though I've had lots of statistical training, I run into analyses that I haven't seen, and I have to try and figure them out, right? I can't just close my eyes, stick my head in the sand and say, it's too tough, I can't learn anything from this study. So here's an example of a regression. What they're trying to do is predict class performance. And we have two variables, class format, availability of these online lectures, and then attendance, whether you came to class. And what you see, both of these do significantly predict class performance. But here's this loaded word, significant. You can say that class format, availability or not of these online lectures, does affect class performance, but that's not the whole picture, right? Because look at how much bigger the effect is for the attendance. So sure, and if I'm trying to understand class performance, this class format, whether they had the slides or lectures available online or not, seems to be a factor, but let's not cloud this judgment, because this is a much more important and a much larger effect. So sometimes if we're looking at psychological research, we don't just want to know what's significant. That's important as a first step, but the next step would be, okay, of all the things that are significant, which have the most significant or the biggest effects? Also, I'm always looking to develop the course to reflect what seems to be best practice in the teaching of Introduction to Psychology. So I won't spend too much time on this, but again, to show you, I had this question, so let's look up some research to see what other people are doing in terms of best practice. So of course, we see a sample size of 24 students, so we're not getting great quantitative or numerical data, but that wasn't the point of this study. What I really liked was this table talking about the different kinds of content and also the project types that are used to assess or measure that stuff. So of course, you've got to think like a psychologist. We do some myth busting, and we do some observational research. We try and apply what we've learned to the environment around us. And notice, some of the things that are on this sort of best practices table are some of the things that we'll do in this class. So we'll have to actually look at scientific studies, right? You may have to do, I won't have you do mock congressional testimony, but take a position and use evidence to support your argument. So not only do you know the definitions of the psychological terms, but also can you apply them to a specific example that you think is important. So in a nutshell, I'm not trying to torture you by forcing you to dig into these boring studies and to dig deep into examples of psychology sometimes. I think it's good practice, and others do as well, and that's why we're going to cover some of them at times over the semester. So in conclusion, we've covered a lot of stuff. Hopefully we've got you somewhat interested in psychology. I'd like to know, What are you excited to learn about? Why do you want to learn about this? How might you use it? This is a great time to ask questions. You can ask questions about the material. What do you want me to know about Freud and psychoanalysis, for example? Or can you explain to me again what the humanistic perspective is? This is what I think it means. How am I doing? Or if you just have general questions about the class, there's a separate thread for that. Anything you have procedurally or content-wise about the class, feel free to ask. And finally, this is the most important step, I think. How does some of this stuff fit with what you've experienced, people you know, situations you've been in? Because once again, the more that you do that and make those connections, the more likely that you are to recall that information when you need it later on. So thanks for listening. I'm looking forward to discussing all this and more on the discussion boards.